Now onto the fun stuff, or how to keep your food safe while you're cooking. I always love this stuff. It's my favorite part. So again, you're going to need a reliable thermometer. And you use your food thermometer to measure the internal temperature of foods to make sure they've been heated to a safe temperature. And that temperature will vary depending on what it is you're cooking. But a good safe number to shoot for is 160 degrees. Pretty much everything dies at 160 degrees Fahrenheit, minus a few things, that you'll learn about later. You always want to measure in the thickest, innermost part of the food. Now, all of this goes for reheating leftovers too. Like leftovers are generally considered TCS foods because they're a mixture of foods. And so you want to heat them to about 160 to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And you want to measure in the deepest, innermost part of the leftovers. When it comes to meat, and that includes both cuts and roasts, you want to cook all steaks, chops, and roasts to a minimum internal temperature of 145 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the theory is that all bacteria and pathogens live on the surface of the meat. So when you've cooked the internal temperature of the meat, at the innermost part of that piece of meat, the external temperature is much higher than 145 degrees. It's probably closer to 160, 170, even 180, depending on how thick the piece of meat is that you're cooking. Now, of course, this will vary depending on if you're cooking a steak or a roast and how thick it is, but this is a good general rule to stick to. Here's the thing though, ground meat is totally different. Ground meat is playing by a completely different game. The reason for that is pathogens and microbes tend to live on the surface of meat. So if you're cooking a steak or a roast or a chicken breast, as soon as you throw that piece of meat into the oven or on the stove and the surface hits 160 degrees, all of the bacteria on the surface are killed. Well, with ground meat, you run into a problem because when you're grinding meat, you're basically taking the meat from a bunch of different animals and throwing it in a big grinder. And so the surfaces of all those individual cuts are all being mixed up into the middle of this big mishmash of ground meat. And this problem is compounded by the fact that if you're grinding a single steak, you only have to worry about the contamination of the one cow that steak came from. If you're eating ground beef or ground pork or ground chicken or ground lamb or ground anything from a much larger operation, there's no telling how many different animal parts went into that grinder. And you're potentially putting yourself at risk simply because if there's 50 animal cuts in there, 100 animal cuts, if one of those animals is contaminated, it creates a problem for the whole batch. This is why I really like grinding my own meat at home. And you don't need a fancy meat grinder to do it. You can do it in a food processor. You just buy some chuck roast or stew meat from the butcher, and then you cut it into relatively small, 1-inch chunks, and you pulse it a couple times in the food processor, and you have beautiful ground beef at home using only a single cut of meat, which is far less risky than using industrialized ground beef. Here's the thing though, you got to make sure not to over pulse it in the food processor, otherwise you'll just end up with meat soup or meat glue. You just need to go zit, 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 and it's done. Poultry is also playing by its own little game because poultry is particularly susceptible to contamination with salmonella. So you want to cook all poultry, that includes chicken, that includes turkey, to a safe minimum internal temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees Celsius. In the case of whole birds cooked breast up, the dark meat takes longer to cook. That's just the way it is. There's a couple different ways you can remedy this. What I personally like to do is start the bird breast down so that the thighs cook a little faster in the beginning, and then halfway through cooking, I flip the bird over and cook it until the breasts are done. And then I measure both the breast and the thighs to make sure they're both at temperature. Now, in the event that one part of the bird is at temperature and the rest is not, you don't want to sacrifice the already cooked part of the bird and dry it out just to cook the other part that's not yet cooked. So what I recommend doing is cutting off the part of the chicken that still needs a few more minutes to cook, put it back in the oven by itself and let it cook the rest of the way while the first part of your bird that's already at temperature does not dry out. Now, if you're one of those households that loves to stuff your bird with stuffing, I gotta warn you, stuffing poultry is super risky. Stuffing is a top TCS food. It's high in carbs, it's high in protein, it's high in moisture. It is like a bacteria, European vacation. Bacteria is super stoked in stuffing. And if you stuff a bird with stuffing, what happens is the outside of that bird is going to get super dried out by the time the internal temperature of the stuffing is safe enough to eat. You need to cook stuffing to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 74 degrees Celsius in order to be safe. The problem is that would drastically overcook your bird. So it's always safest and much easier and much less frustrating just to cook your stuffing outside of the bird. Here are some other really important temperatures to know. So for fin fish, and that's fish with fins, you want to cook them to 145 degrees Fahrenheit or 63 degrees Celsius. FYI, this may not yield an entirely ideal texture on the fish, but it's the safe temperature. If you cook your fish to less than 145 degrees Fahrenheit, that's totally up to you. But I have to let you know that 145 degrees is the temperature mandated by the FDA and USDA to create safe fish. Now, eggs, again, are kind of playing their own little game, right? Eggs are highly prone to bacterial growth and microbe growth. So you want to cook egg dishes to 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees centigrade. And that includes leftovers with eggs in them. Now, when it comes to casseroles, casseroles are super TCS foods. They tend to be carby and liquidy and proteiny. And so you want to cook those to 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 74 degrees centigrade. And again, that includes leftovers. When it comes to reheating leftovers, you want to bring sauces, soups, and gravies to a full boil when reheating and then let them boil for about 5 minutes before serving. This should kill pretty much anything that's grown in them. But they can be a little, finicky because they're liquidy. And if you bring them to a boil too quickly over high heat, I guarantee you they will burn to the bottom of the pot and taste terrible. So I recommend bringing them to a boil over medium-low heat. It's like 3 on your dial, and covering the pot to make sure that the liquid doesn't evaporate. And then every few minutes, go in there and just give it a good stir and scrape the bottom of the pot and make sure nothing is sticking. Again, other leftovers need to be heated to at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit or 74 degrees Celsius. Leftovers tend to be a mishmash of different things, like they might contain meat or bread or eggs or vegetables. They've got moisture in them, like they've got protein, carbs, fat. And that's when you're cooking leftovers, 165 is a good temperature to shoot for because it kills almost everything. And you want to hold them at that temperature for a few minutes before serving. So you can't bring them to 165 and then turn the oven off and think you're done. You want to hold them at 165 with the pot covered for at least 5 minutes to make sure all of the food is heated through completely and any bacteria that may have grown in there are killed. Now that was a lot of temperatures I just threw at you, and they can be a little overwhelming and hard to remember. So I've included a cheat sheet to this module that you can download, and it will list all the temperatures you need to remember right at your fingertips.